Hello, I'm Alvin. I'm making this video as a supplemental guide to the instructions that I wrote for how to join 16 gauge automotive wire via soldering. So we will start with an equipment and supply list and then move from there. So for equipment, what you'll need is a soldering iron or a soldering gun. I will be using a soldering gun, some soldering iron tips if your soldering gun or soldering iron does not come with them. So this is just for instructional purpose. Soldering iron stand or holder if you're using a soldering iron. But if you're using a soldering gun, most soldering guns, they have a backing here to place it on its back to eliminate having that holder or stand. You'll need some helping hands, which is this tool right here, and this is utilized to hold your wire while you need to solder a joint. A heat gun, some wire snips and wire strippers. I have two tools right here. Both of these tools have wire snips already incorporated into them, which makes things a lot more simplified and requiring one less tool. You'll need a ruler. Just a standard ruler is fine. It doesn't have to be metal or anything like that, as long as it has something that you could use to measure the length of your cuts in your wire. You'll need a marker. Any marker is fine as long as it's something that you can use to mark your wire where you need to make your cuts or stripping the ends of your wire strand. A sponge. This is just a regular dish sponge. It is brand new. A container to hold your sponge and some water. There's already water on the sponge though. For supplies, obviously you will need some rosin core solder. You'll need your flux, 1/8 inch shrink wrap tubing, a rag or a shop towel. I just have a shop towel right here, and then of course your 16 gauge wire. Definitely recommend wearing personal protective equipment. I have some gloves right here, and you definitely want to wear something such as goggles or some ballistic eyewear to protect your eyes from any of the fumes and or potential splatter. So we'll go ahead and begin. First, you want to start with donning your personal protective equipment. As you saw in the beginning, I am wearing glasses, and I will make mention that you are handling tools that operate at 600 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition to that, you want to use a workspace or an area that you're going to be performing soldering that is non-flammable, because the solder is going to turn into molten metal and you do not want to start a fire. So we'll go ahead and begin. Start with preparing your workspace. Best thing you want to do is familiarize yourself with how you want to organize all your tools, equipment, and supplies. Again, mainly because you're dealing with high temperature tools and you don't want to start fires or cause injuries such as burning yourself. Preferred, you would like to have your soldering iron or gun on the same side as your dominant hand, so it's easily accessible. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of organize everything to my liking. All right, so the first thing you're going to want to do is remove the insulation that is over your wire strand that's made out of plastic. But for this specific application, since we just had the one wire strand, you want to cut this in half. So figure out about roughly where the halfway point is, and then you're going to want to cut it in half, as already mentioned. So we'll go ahead and use these wire strippers right here, like so. Now, you'll want to remove about 1/2 inch of insulation from each wire strand from the wire ends. So what you'll do is you'll take your ruler, measure it out from the wire end where your strand terminates, like so. Go ahead and take the Sharpie and mark 1/2 inch from your wire end. That's about 1/2 inch there. Now, what we'll do, set that aside. We'll start with this style of a wire stripper. So you're going to place your wire end inside the cutting mechanism right there where it has that diamond shape. And what you're going to want to do, if you do have the roller in there, unfortunately mine does not have that, you'll want to place it on the 16 gauge indicator on the tool. And you'll place your marked area within that cutting portion of your tool. Close the tool like so, and then go ahead and slide the insulation off while pulling the opposite side back toward you, like so. And that's how you strip one side. For this next one, I will demonstrate with the other tool. This is my preferred tool because it works for multiple size wires and it's more ergonomic. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and measure again. So you got your 1/2 inch away from your terminating end of your wire strand. Same thing applies with this tool, except for it's important to understand what part of the tool actually cuts the wire insulation and what part pulls back. So on the left side of the tool, you're right. There's your blade there, right there. That will cut the wire. And then your left side, or the tool's right, that's what's going to grab the wire and pull back as it's stripping the insulation. So go ahead and place your marked portion of the wire inside the tool like so. Right there, right where it cuts the insulation. And once it's gripped in there to the point where you don't have to worry about it falling out, just go ahead and clamp, and it's done, just like that. It's nice, quicker. All right, so go ahead and set your tools aside. Now what you're going to need to do is slide a piece of shrink tubing over one of your wire strands. So you're going to want about 1 inch, because what you're going to want to do is not only have coverage over the exposed joint, but you also want to have coverage over the existing insulation. So about 1 inch there. You're going to want to mark the 1 inch mark, like so. Go ahead and take your snips, place where you're going to cut inside your snip, and now you have your shrink wrap tubing. So it doesn't matter which wire you want to slide it over, you just slide it over one. I know that this is an open end, but when you're using it for specific applications, this needs to go first, or else you won't have a way to install this after you've joined your wire ends. like so, just like that. Now your next step, you're going to want to introduce some flux on these wire strands. So go ahead and grab your flux. I like to just dip it in the flux, and I'll do that with both sides. You can be pretty liberal with this. It serves two purposes. The first is to protect from oxidation, protect the wire strands from oxidation while you're soldering, and two, it almost acts like a lubricant for the molten solder to permeate through the strands of the copper wires when heat is introduced. So once you do that, you can put that to the side. Your next step is you're going to join the wires together, and you do so, well, first you want to straighten these out. You do so by taking your wire ends facing each other. It doesn't matter which one you put on top or bottom. And what you're going to want to do, once you get it to this point like this, just twist it together, kind of like you're braiding it. But you don't want it to be too tight because you still want enough space in the wire for the solder and your flux to flow through. If it's too tight, the solder won't permeate through the strands and you won't have that strong of a connection. So just enough to keep it together, but also to the point where you can have solder flowing through the strands. So from here, now what you'll want to do is clamp your joint in between the helping hands. And you'll also want to have your shrink wrap tubing outside of that soldering area, because if you don't, you could prematurely shrink it before you join your wire ends permanently. So go ahead and put it in the helping hands. Okay. And this is kind of where your rag comes into play, or your shop towel. You're going to want to wipe your hands off so you can have control over your equipment. Okay, now this is where you'll take your soldering iron or soldering gun. Again, I have a soldering iron here. First thing you're going to want to do, the soldering gun actually has a trigger, so it's a lot easier to control. Most basic soldering irons don't have that type of control. You connect it to a power outlet and you wait for it to heat up. But this one, you pull the trigger to activate it, and it will slowly introduce heat into the tip, the soldering iron tip. So what you're going to do, this is a used tip, so you're going to want to clean off the oxidation, and this is where your sponge comes into play. It's always best just to keep your sponge on your work surface so you don't have to worry about losing control of anything. So keep it firm, and then just wipe your soldering iron tip like so on both sides. Again, this is just to clean off the oxidation. Like so, right there. If you have a new soldering iron tip, it's not a necessary step. All right, so now go ahead and place your sponge to the side. I'll just place it on my left side right here. Grab your rosin core solder. You're going to want to pull out, I'd say probably 5 or 6 inches. You definitely don't want it too short, because for one, you want to keep the heat away from your hands, and two, you want to have enough to introduce solder as it starts to melt. So go ahead and hold your container of solder in a way that it feels comfortable for you, preferably with the hand that is not your dominant hand, because your dominant hand should be controlling your soldering iron tool. All right, so from here you want to position your helping hand and your joint in a way that'll be easiest for you to solder. So just for this demonstration, I am going to move this a little bit so that way you can see. Now, preparing to solder, so go ahead and get your soldering iron prepared to touch your strand here. Actually, for this one, it looks like the strand kind of separated a little bit, but that's okay. If that happens, you can go ahead and just put it back together. You don't want to have strands sticking out like that, because once you get solder on it, it's going to puncture your insulation. And so now that that's complete, go ahead and activate your soldering iron. If you have a soldering gun, use the trigger like so. And what you're going to do, so you'll see that it will start to smoke a little bit. That's when you'll know that it's hot enough to melt the solder. Go ahead and take the tip, touch and hold underneath the wire strand, and as it starts to smoke, as you can see, that means it is at a adequate temperature to melt the solder. Introduce your solder over the strand, like so. It may take a few minutes, but just let the solder naturally flow through the strands. You can move it left and right a little bit, but the whole point of the solder is to flow through the strands to create an adequate connection that will be permanent. I'll go ahead and remove both the soldering iron and the solder away from the joint right away. That way you don't over solder and you don't burn the wire. So from here, you're going to want to let that cool down to, for one, to ensure that you're not burning your hand, and two, you could possibly prematurely shrink your tubing again when sliding it over your joint. So while you're waiting for that, you can go ahead and clean your soldering tip again if you're going to prepare for another wire to solder. But I like to just clean after every use, so that way it's prepared for the next time I want to use this. All right, so go ahead and set that aside. And now this should be cool enough. So from here, you're going to want to slide your shrink wrap tubing over the wire, or excuse me, over your joint that's soldered. Actually, I will go ahead and bring this up closer so you can actually see. That is a solid joint that will not come apart. All right. So go ahead and slide your shrink wrap tubing over your joint. I'm actually using a marine grade style shrink wrap tubing, and I choose this because it has a glue that's inside of it that creates a better seal over your joint. Okay, so once you have your shrink wrap tubing over the joint, go ahead and grab your soldering gun, or excuse me, your heat gun, and introduce heat. This will just take a few moments, and basically you just want to do this until your tubing hugs your joint and the remaining insulation. You can sweep the heat gun left and right a little bit, but you want to ensure you're staying over the areas that you want to introduce heat into to shrink your shrink wrap tubing. Go ahead and give that a few minutes before I bring that closer to the camera. All right. And right there, that is how you join two wire ends to create a solder joint, and that's your completed product.